Hi, I'm Nika, I'm David's wife, and this is an event in the honor of the first anniversary of David Graeber's passing, and in the spirit of his rejection of academic arrogance and our urgent need to get out of the crisis we are in, we set up the art project, Fight Club. Welcome to the first one of the series. Today we're talking about what is debt. The next one will be about the nature of money. David was probably the most famous anthropologist of our times and a best-selling author. Even still, he had a folder in his computer called Nightmare, in which he dumped all bills, bureaucratic papers, invoices, and papers of his academic achievements. He regards the idea of isolated individual as a myth. What interested David much more was a dialogue. He believed that it is only in dialogue, in the clash of opinions, where answers are formed and our human consciousness is born. We humans, according to David, are the product of our social relationship. That's why it was so important for him to be involved in a situation in which people think and act collectively. And David Graeber Foundation will follow the same path. So we have several projects lined up, from collective editing of his archive to publishing the anthology of the Fight Club, starting from the first debate between David Graeber and Peter Thiel. As Fight Club official cheerleader, I urge our fighters to be emotional, provocative, and bold, because the questions that we'll discuss concern us all. If enough of us will change the way we think about what debt means, then the social design of our society will change along with this. So this is just that, as David described, what a revolution is, a change of common sense and the collective imagination. And David argued that the main achievement of the Paris Commune, despite its defeat, had been the transformation of the common sense about how we live together. So most of what we consider ordinary in our cities, public transportation, street lights, public schools, the 8 hours work days, and even the not yet achieved equal pay for women and men, originated in the Paris Commune. And it was then considered to be a social madness. So the same can be said about Occupy, those 10th anniversary we celebrated now, just as we celebrate David's life. Occupy didn't take over any territory, it didn't have leaders in government, but it did change the public discourse. It's become important to talk about equality, poverty, and debt. So after Occupy, we all look at the world differently. Speaking on debt, the position of our fighters today are radically different. I want to express my immense gratitude to Thomas Piketty, who replied to my email, although we didn't know each other, and agreed to participate in this debate. I also want to thank Michael Hudson, who came up with many of the ideas that David Graeber built upon in his book, 5,000 Years of Debt. And I really hope that this debate can radically change the way we think about the world. And what else could be more exciting? So I pass to Lynn, who thank you for agreeing to moderate this discussion.
Well, it's my great pleasure, and it's wonderful to welcome everyone from all over the world. We share some commonalities in our human experience, and one of them is that we tend to come into the world, most of us, sort of undercapitalized for the experience. So in a sense, most of us are united in debt, and that's why it's especially exciting to have two such brilliant thinkers help us unpack this difficult subject from the suitcase where we like to push it way into the back of the closet. Today, I'm very delighted to welcome my friend Michael Hudson. He is a distinguished professor of economics at the University of Missouri, Kansas City. He's also a researcher at the Levy Institute at Bard. He's a former Wall Street analyst and a frequent commenter on economic matters and historical matters. He's written extensively about debt, and as you just heard from Nika, his work was a great inspiration for David Graeber. He can also tell you more about the ancient Sumerians than you ever dreamed of knowing. So hopefully we get to hear a little bit about that today. Welcome, Professor Hudson. And welcome also to Thomas Piketty. He is the professor at the EHESS in the Paris School of Economics, and he's also the co-director of the World Inequality Lab. You know him for going viral with his books telling us why most of us don't have any money. Of course, there was his smash hit, Capitalism in the 21st Century, and more recently, which you must get if you haven't read it, Capitalism and Ideology. Welcome to you, Professor Piketty. And we'll start out having each of you tell us your thoughts about debt, your position on the topic. And you'll have about 5 minutes each. And I think we'll start with you, Professor Hudson.
I thought we were going to let Tom go first. Otherwise, he's going to be saying
that's fine. That's
all the things I agree with that he wrote, and let him say what he wrote.
That's fine with me. Thomas, would you like to go first?
Yeah, whatever is fine. I mean, so okay. Let me say a few words first. Let me, thank you for organizing this, and I was very. When I received Nika's email, I felt, I felt very emotional because, I remember very well the discussion we had with David Graeber back in 2013 in Paris, which was right after my book, Capital in the 21st Century, was first published in French. It was not yet available in English, so David had not read it, but I had read his book on debt, the first 10,000 years, and this was, this was for me, this was really a very, powerful reading, and this made me think a lot. Maybe it was not so visible in Capital in the 21st Century because I had written it actually before I could read David's book, but to me this was really a major, and this is a major contribution. So what about debt? Let me simply say that there will be in the future. There will be, again, other debt cancellation, massive debt cancellation. So, there are long cycles about debt, which of course, David talks about when we go back to ancient history or to Sumerian times, and as Michael has been working on. And so you have this long run cycle, but you also have, a more short run history of debt cancellation, a more or medium run history, if you want. And I think it's very important to remember in particular that, after there are two modern episodes which I find particularly striking in terms of getting debt back to zero, or at least, cancelling a big part of debt. The French Revolution, of course, is a very important example. So, this was a time when basically the political system did not manage to pay those who should have paid for the public spending, which was the nobility. So there was a flight toward debt because the people who should have paid the tax managed somehow to escape. And the solution was the French Revolution, the end of fiscal privileges of the aristocracy, the cancellation of debt partly through inflation, partly through taxation. And that's sort of one modern episode. The other modern episode which I want to refer to is, of course, after World War II. In 1945, 1950, most rich economies had public debt which were enormous, even bigger than today, and they made the choices. The political choice through, very conflictual social movement, political fights. In the end, the choice was made collectively not to repay this debt. So this happens in various ways, inflation in some cases, but some countries like Germany in particular, which is viewed today as very conservative in terms of economic doctrine and ideology, and which in many ways is very conservative. We'll see after the election in a few days, but it's still going to be quite conservative probably in any case. But in fact, after World War II, applied a solution to get rid of the debt of the past through monetary reform and through progressive taxation of very high wealth holders in order to, in effect, compensate the lower wealth holders for the monetary reform and the loss of holding that was implied by monetary reform. So that in the end, this was certainly not a perfect system, but as compared to all other ways getting rid of past debt. This was certainly one of the most equitable, or at least unequitable way to address the problem. And I think we will have also an episode like this in the future. So nobody knows the form it will take. The kind of political mobilization. Occupy was an important episode. There will be other. There are other. Social movement, tax revolt. If you think of the Yellow Vest movement in France a couple of years ago, which was a major tax revolt to get rid of a very, what I think was a very unequal project to raise carbon tax basically on the poorest group in society. And there will be, to address climate challenges, but also, all sorts of social and developmental challenges. Societies will have to find ways of getting rid of their debt. Right now, we have this illusion that we can just take it on the central bank coffer and forget about it. But I think it will be more conflictual and more less peaceful than this, because it's always a matter in the end of redefining power relation between different social groups. So it cannot be completely peaceful. It involves conflicting social interests. It involves different groups of people with different agenda. And, in many ways, we are in a situation which is not, I think, completely different from the one at the time of the French Revolution, which is that those who should pay have somehow managed to design a legal system and a political system so that they can escape taxation, and at the same time, middle class and lower class people are fed up of paying the bill for them, and so the solution is more and more debt. But at some point, there will have to be something else will have to happen, and I think it will be roughly the same. It will have to be roughly the same solution as what it was, 200 years ago, which is the end of fiscal privileges of a small group in the population that has managed to escape taxation for too long. So that's okay. That's a sort of initial perspective on that. But of course, I'd be very interested to hear Michael and continue the discussion.
Thank you. Michael, floor is yours.
Okay. Well, I certainly appreciated the book that you published on the accumulation of wealth and how it's concentrated in the hands of the 1%. I think everybody knew intuitively that this was the case, but economists being who they are, they don't really accept something until it's all there in statistics. And you did just a wonderful job in tying together all of these statistics and showing the degree to which wealth is, the 1% had concentrated wealth in every country. And you also made, I think, the most important point where you said, what's caused this? And you came up with the broad answer that I agree with. You said that financial returns exceed the overall rate of growth. And if financial returns exceed the overall rate of growth, of course, you're going to have the rich getting richer and richer. And I think the reason where we have a different approach is, how do you explain all of this? Well, when your book came out, a number of writers said, well, this is the marks of the 20th century. And you showed that there was an abrupt turning point in 1980, and everything had been changed there. And I think the 1% looked at your statistics as a success story. They said, yep, we're really doing better than everybody else. And as the head of Goldman Sachs said, that's because we're so productive. But I think the reason your book was praised so much in the West is you didn't come up with a threatening political solution. And when they said this was book is the Marx for modern time, that meant don't read Marx, read this book. And I suspect that after you put all of this enormous good work into the statistics that you did on wealth and income, I think the publisher probably said, well, what are your solutions? Well, you just came up with the solution that you said in the book, and that's to tax income and wealth. This is not a threatening solution, because there's no way that you're going to tax wealth as long as you have offshore banking centers to conceal wealth, as long as you have what the oil industry put in place 100 years ago, the flags of convenience, pretending to make their income abroad. The fact is, the 1% don't really make much income. They're ideal. If you're a billionaire, you want to do what half of American corporations do. You don't make a penny of taxable income. That's the whole problem. So I want to go into what your book was not about. I'm not criticizing you for not writing a different book, but it's what I write about, and that is what is it that has created this disparity, and why has it widened so much since 1980? Well, the most obvious reason is interest rates reached a peak of 20% in 1980, and they've gone down ever since. Well, in the late 1970s, my old boss's boss at Chase Manhattan, Paul Volcker, said, let's raise interest rates to very high because the 99% are getting too much income. Their wages are going up. Let's raise interest to slow the economy, and that will prevent wages from going up. And he did, and that was a large reason why Carter lost the election to Ronald Reagan. Interest rates then went down from 20% to almost 0% today. The result was the largest bond market boom in history. Bonds went way up in price. The economy was flooded with bank credit. And most of this credit, apart from going into the bond market, went into real estate. And there is a symbiosis between finance and real estate, and also between finance and raw materials, and also like oil and gas and minerals extraction, natural resource rent, land rent, and also monopoly rent. And most of the monopoly rent has come from the privatization that you had from Ronald Reagan, Margaret Thatcher, and the whole neoliberalism. If you look at how did this 1% get most of its wealth? Well, if you look at the Forbes list of the billionaires in almost every country, they got wealth in the old-fashioned way, from taking it from the public domain. In other words, privatization. You had the largest privatization and transfer of wealth from the public sector to the private sector, and specifically to the financial sector in history. Sell-offs, and all of a sudden, instead of infrastructure, public health, other basic needs being provided at subsidized rates to the population, you have privatized owners financed by the banks raising the rates to whatever rate they can get without any market borrowing power. In the United States, the government is not even allowed to bargain with the pharmaceutical companies for the drug prices. So there's been a huge monopolization, a huge privatization, a huge flooding of the economy with credit, and one person's credit is somebody else's debt. So you've described the 1%'s wealth in the form of savings, but I focus on the other side of the balance sheet. This 1% finds its counterpart in the debts of the 99%. So the 1% has got wealthy by indebting the 99% for housing that has soared in price, 20% just in the last year in the United States, for medical care, for utilities, for education. The economy is being forced increasingly into debt. And how can one solve this? Taxation will not be enough. The only way that you can actually reverse this concentration of wealth is to begin wiping out the debt. If you leave the debt in place of the 99%, then you're going to leave the 1%'s savings all in place. And these savings are largely tax exempt. So basically, I think you left out the government's role in this wealth creation of the 1%. your finance has indeed grown faster than the economy. Finance has absorbed real estate into the finance, insurance, and real estate sector, the fire sector. Finance has absorbed the oil industry, the mining industry, and it's absorbed most of the government. So the financial wealth has spilled over to become essentially the economy's central planner. It's not planned in Washington or Paris or London. It's planned in Wall Street, the City of London, and the Paris Bourse. The economy is being managed financially, and the object of financial management isn't really to make money. It's capital gains. And again, as your statistics point out, capital gains are really what explains the increase in wealth. You don't get rich by saving the income. Rent is for paying interest. Income is for paying interest. You get rich off the government basically subsidizing an enormous increase in the value of stocks, the value of bonds by the central banks, which have been privatized. And the reason that this is occurring is that the largest public utility of all, money creation and banking, is left in private hands, and private banking in the West is very different from what government banking is in, say, China. Government banking would create credit for public uses, for what the economy needs to grow. In the United States and throughout the West, banks create credit to slow the economy from growing. They make loans only not to create new means of production, new factories, and they make loans against property already in place, mainly real estate already in place. 80% of bank loans in America and Europe are for real estate. They make loans for corporate takeovers. They make loans to buy other companies. They don't make loans to build new factories, which is what a government money creation in, say, China would do. So as long as you leave banking and credit in private hands, you're going to have banks creating their product, debt. And the more debt they create, the more debt service that the borrowers, the 99%, have to pay the banks in order to obtain a house or an education or medical care or just to break even. And the more money they pay to the financial sector, the less they have to pay for goods and services. So as the economy polarizes between the 1% and the 99%, the economy as a whole shrinks because more and more of its income is spent not on production and consumption, it's spent just on debt service. So my solution is you have to restore banking and credit into public hands to prevent the kind of lending that makes asset price inflation. Secondly, you talked about taxing. Some taxes are more important than others. I don't think that as long as the banks and the financial sector write the tax codes, as long as the government lawmakers are basically employees of the financial sector who finances their political campaigns, you're not going to be able to tax them or to close down the fake transfer pricing that corporations use to pretend not to make money. So you have to tax the source of the money that pays interest to the banks itself. And that source is mainly economic rent. It's land rent. If you would have a tax on the increase in land value, if you'd have a land tax, which is what the whole 19th century was about, Adam Smith, John Stuart Mill, Marx, then if you would not have this increased rent being paid to the financial sector to be monopolized by the 1%. So you'd have to change the way in which the tax code is based away from just overall income and wealth, which is really not very practical in today's political situation. You'd have to have a land tax and a natural resource tax. And to get rid of monopoly rent, you have to return basic key infrastructure to the public domain, where it was before 1980, so that basic needs can be supplied at low prices, not creating monopoly for the 1%. And I guess I'm saying you have to realize that finance has used its wealth to take over the economy, and this has to be reversed because once you have wealth taking the form of loans and claims on other people's debt, well, you have compound interest. Any rate of interest is a doubling time. And compound interest is always going to grow faster than the economy's real growth. And the only way to prevent this isn't simply to lower the interest rate, which you've done today to 0.1%. The only solution is to wipe out the overall debts that are stopping economic growth. And these debts are the savings of the 1%. The good thing about canceling debts is you cancel the savings of the 1%. And as long as you leave these savings in place, there's not going to be a solution.
Thank you so much, Michael. And Thomas, feel free to respond to this idea of canceling debt.
Yeah, I don't feel we have any major disagreement about everything you just said, Michael. Let me say also regarding my book Capital in the 21st Century. It's a book that has lots of limitation, and I have on many issues. I've tried to make progress since then. So this was written 10 years ago. I wrote Capital and Ideology much more recently, which I think addresses some of the shortcomings. But this is, and still this book has also a lot of limitations. So, I'm trying to make progress all the time. And I certainly don't pretend that all the answers are in one book. And that being said, I think, many things that you've mentioned, I fully agree with that. As I said, the cancellation of debt is very important because, as you very well said, the part of the increase in private wealth at the top was really made through privatization of public assets, increase in public debt. There's one statistic which I stress a lot, which is that if you look at the net wealth of the public sector, the net wealth of the government, so government assets minus government debt, it used to be, in the 1970s, net public wealth was, between 20-30% of total national wealth. So, net private wealth was bigger, was like 70 or 80%, but still net public wealth was 20-30% in Germany, in the US, in France, in Britain, in Japan. So that was, a substantial part of everything there was to own in terms of marketable assets in society belonged to the public domain, say around 1/4 or between 1/4 and 1/3. Today, so, 3-4 decades later, it is close to zero or actually negative in the US or in the UK, in the sense that the public debt is bigger than the public assets because many public assets were privatized and public debt increased. And, in effect, there was a transfer of public wealth to private wealth holders, and that's a very important evolution. Which you see, the most extreme case, of course, will be Russia and post-communist country, where you just transfer all the public wealth and you make oligarchs out of nothing. But in fact, with all countries have had these kind of trajectories over the recent decades. So that's really an important part of the stories that I've been trying to tell. So again, I don't think we have any disagreement on this. At an even broader level, it's all about power and political institutions. So as you said, as long as the system of political finance and, parties and campaigns and media and think tank, are largely controlled by large wealth holders, our collective ability to change the distribution of wealth and through taxation or debt cancellation and all whatever the method is going to be limited. So it will take major political fight and in some cases, change in the political rules of the game and the political institution to change this. And the good news is that this has always been like this, or this has always and still sometimes it has worked in the past, but it has worked. I mentioned the French Revolution. Of course, that's a huge popular mobilization. Also in the 20th century, I mentioned after World War II or after World War I. Well, let's be clear. It's only because there was a very powerful, labor movement, a socialist movement, and communist counter model in the East, which in the end put pressure on the elite, governing elite in the West, so that they had to accept a number of decisions, which were limited in their scope, but still which transform the economic and social system in a very substantial way as compared to the pre-World War I and 19th century economic system. But it's only through this enormous political mobilization and collective organization. And, it will be the same in the past. So just one last point, you mentioned the case of China. And, I think the Chinese counter model can contribute maybe in the future also to sort of put pressure on the West to change their system. Also at this stage, we are not, the big difference, of course, with the Soviet counter model is that the Soviet counter model, you had a sort of a narrative and a proximity between socialist and communist party and the labor movement, so that in effect, the elite in the West felt threatened by this counter model, and this contributed to reinforce, to some extent, until a certain point, the labor movement in the West. Well, until the final fall of the Soviet Union, which of course reinforced a lot, hyper-capitalist ideology and everything we've seen since then. The Chinese model, you mentioned the fact that the banking system is working a bit more to the service of the real economy and infrastructure and investment than the banking system in the West. But by and large, the Chinese model, looks more and more like a sort of perfect digital dictatorship, and nobody really wants to to copy this. And apart from other government elite, who would like to keep quiet their population and their grassroots movement as efficiently as the Beijing regime is doing. But apart from nobody in the world, no collective movement in the world wants to look like this. So this also limits the sort of the pressure that this counter model can put on the West. But at the end of the day, I think this can be one of the forces which still can induce. For instance, when we talk about the taxation of multinational in 2021, which, what has been decided by rich countries, is very limited. They claim they have solved the problem of multinational taxation, but it's a bit ridiculous how little they have done. The minimum tax rate of 15% is ridiculously small. And also, it's only sort of sharing, rich countries are sharing between themselves, the tax base that is currently in tax haven, but countries in the South, in the global South, basically don't get anything. And I think that's an issue, that's an area in which the pressure of the Chinese counter model in the future maybe will contribute to induce rich countries to have a bit more inclusive attitude towards the South. Also, well, if they don't do it, in effect, China will finance the investment and the infrastructure investment that is needed in Africa and in South Asia, and that's this is at some point, hopefully, Western countries will realize that they have to change something, otherwise they will just lose any influence and any capacity to influence the world. Okay, so this is getting us very far from the initial discussion, but I hope this is still more or less relevant.
Michael, feel free to respond.
Well, it would not surprise me if we end up in agreement with what to do. And I realize that you wrote your book about your topic, and I wrote my book about what to do about it. I just want to point out where I think we do have a disagreement. My point is that compound interest is always going to grow faster than the economy's real ability to grow. So in the end, debts can't be paid. Right now, you see a lot of third world debts that if the third world debtor countries have to pay their foreign debts as the world economy slows down, they're going to be subject to austerity, to the World Bank's and the IMF's austerity programs, and they're going to be kept in poverty. Is it really right that they should be kept in poverty just to enrich the bondholders of the 1%? The 1% will say, yes, that's why we're the 1%, so that we can impoverish other people. That's our liberty. Our liberty is the right to impoverish other people and reduce them to dependency. That will happen if you do not write down the debts. It's already happening in the United States to the student debt crisis, where students have to pay so much money as they fall behind on their student debts that they can't afford to take out mortgages to buy homes. And you're having the home ownership rates plunge in the United States. That's the result of leaving the debts in place. The mortgage debts are causing shrinkage. So there is no way to get out of this economic polarization without a debt write-down, and that's something that's too radical. And when we talk about, when I was referring to what China's doing, I'm referring to what it's doing today and tomorrow about the real estate company Evergrande. China has a choice. Is it going to leave Evergrande's real estate debts in place? And Evergrande, as a real estate company, is 2 to 3% of the entire Chinese economy. If it pays the foreign creditors and the domestic 1% of China, it's going to impoverish the employees of Evergrande. It's going to make housing prices more and more expensive in China. China has had a debt-financed housing boom. If you leave the debts in place, then you're going to impoverish China. And obviously, China is going to say, we're not going to put the creditors first. We're not going to do what the West does and say the sanctity of debt service, debts that you owe are sacred. It's worth sacrificing the economy. It's worth plunging the economy into poverty just to preserve the wealth of the 1%. I think China is going to make the opposite decision and say, we're not going to commit political suicide. We're going to operate it's a socialist economy. And when it comes to debt and credit, thank God we have our banking in the public domain. And since the public domain, the People's Bank of China, is the creditor, it can afford to write down the debt without having any political backlash because it's canceling debt owed to itself. Which is a great advantage. And it's also, as for the private bondholders, it's going to say, well, sorry, bondholders, you made loans to a company that was way over leveraged. Already, the American bond rating companies have reduced their bond rating to junk. So you knew what you were buying. If you continued to hold bonds that Fitch and other bond raters, Moody's, all say are junk, and you lose your money, well, you took the risk. You got a high rate of interest. Now you're paying the price. That's how markets work. And that really is the argument. And I think you have to, obviously, what I'm suggesting is a radical step, just as you're suggesting of taxing wealth would require the radical step of closing down offshore banking centers, of simply negating, if banks would simply erase all of the deposits they have from the offshore banking centers, from the Cayman Islands, from Panama, from Liberia, to all the places that began to be set up by the mining companies, the oil companies, and then were set up beginning in the 1960s, essentially by the CIA to finance the Vietnam War by making America, like England, the home for criminal capital, for flight capital. All this flight capital and the kleptocracy that you mentioned in Russia, all this really should be wiped out. And if you leave this capital, if you leave this 1% in place, the economy is going to be sacrificed and shrinking. Is it worth shrinking the economy just to leave the 1% in place? And if you challenge them, that's pretty radical. That's really what I think Marx would say today.
Thank you. And I wanted to just pitch a question to you all before we turn it over to some questions from the audience. You've both mentioned it's not the elephant in the room, it's sort of the Tyrannosaurus Rex in the room. I think, Thomas, as you put it, those who should pay design the system. You both have commented on this enormous problem that we have. Every time we have good ideas, ranging from just a tiny little tax on the rich, to the more radical ideas that Michael is suggesting, we run up against this Tyrannosaurus Rex. So where do you all see the most effective pressure points coming from right now in terms of getting anything accomplished? on debt? Where is the effective mobilization potentially coming from, or that you see developing now?
Maybe let me first say, we need debt cancellation. We need a regular debt cancellation. I don't think at all this is radical or too radical. If anything, I think this is not radical enough, because I think in addition to debt cancellation, we need also to redistribute the assets, to redistribute wealth. And so when I'm talking about taxing wealth, it's also redistributing wealth, so giving wealth to people who don't own anything. So it's not only cancelling their debt, it's also giving them positive ownership rights in companies, in housing. So yeah, I think there's really no disagreement on this. Now, what about the pressures that will come? Well, two things. First, I think the real problem is the system of free capital flow. So the idea is that you can we have created an international legal system where in effect we have an almost sacralized right, you accumulate wealth in a country using the public infrastructures, the education system, the health system of a country, and then you can push on a button, transfer your assets in another jurisdiction, and nobody knows where you are. But there's nothing natural in this system. This was made by a set of international treaties, a particular legal system, and that's just not. So individual countries, I think, have to get rid of that. And so in the case of Europe, you cannot wait for unanimity to get rid of that. So individual countries have to say, okay, I'm not against the circulation of investment and capital goods, but it has to come with common taxation, with common regulation, common rules. This cannot just be like this. You push on a button, we don't know where you are. So this has to go. So some proposals that were made by like Bernie Sanders in the presidential campaign in the US early last year. This seems like ages ago, but this was only 18 months ago. When he said, okay, you can, if you want to escape my federal wealth tax, you can go away, but then you will have to pay a 40% exit tax. You will have to keep 40% of your assets in the US if you want to go out. That's clearly a big change as compared to free capital flow. But that's the kind of change we need to. We need to consider. So how is this going to happen? Well, first we need to realize that the free capital flows treaty agreement, which came a lot actually, in fact, from Europe in the 1980s, but also from Washington, of course. But it was a co-production, if you want. This has to go, and individual countries have to escape that. Other source of change and pressure. I think climate change is going to put a strong pressure in the sense that, I think when people see more and more catastrophic climatic events, I think attitudes toward globalization and attitudes toward inequality in general, can change very quickly, because at some point, I think people will not find it funny at all to have all these billionaires, giving lessons, using their private jet, doing space tourism, etc. At some point, I think nobody is going to find this funny at all, and there can be a very quick and fast, complete change in attitude following this. And I think the Chinese sort of counter model, with all its good and bad, very bad sometimes aspects, can also be a factor of change.
Thank you. Michael, would you like to respond to that?
Yeah, I don't see a change within the existing system. I guess that makes me radical. So Thomas did not mention the main point that he made in his book, which was his number one suggestion was tax inherited wealth, because most wealth is inherited. That's one of the things that he's found. Absolutely right. Great idea. Saint-Simon, the great French economist, had this idea in the very first book he wrote around 1806. It made him very unpopular, and he soon realized that there was no way of doing that. From Saint-Simon on to the entire 19th century of British political and French political economy, they all agreed with Smith and the others, you have to, there's a landlord tax, the 1% in their day were the landlords. You have to tax away the land rent and make that the public tax base, not income, not taxes on consumer goods, not taxes on capital, because you want good capital investment. You want fortunes to be made in a good way. that add to the economy's productivity. You don't want them to be made in a predatory, bad way. The whole fight to tax economic rent and to even recognize that most income is unearned. When you talk about the income disparity, almost all this disparity is unearned income. It's economic rent. It's not income that's made by increasing production. It's not income that's made by increasing living standards. It's just predatory rent seeking from special privileges that the wealthy have gained from government. And today it's not the landlord class anymore, as it was in the 19th century. It's the financial class and the raw materials class. Without dealing with this structure, the system is going to shrink and shrink. And we've seen this before. We saw it in Rome. The same kind of polarization and concentration of wealth in the Roman Empire. Well, the last stage of that is feudalism. So we're back to what Rosa Luxemburg said, the choices between socialism and barbarism, basically. And there's no other way to do it. You can't solve the problems within the existing system because it's controlled already by the 1%.
Thank you, Michael. And I'd like to toss out a couple of questions from the audience now. We have a question about energy. One viewer asks, isn't energy as much a source of value as land? Should we have progressive taxes on energy use as well, or instead of land value tax?
First of all, land doesn't have any value, nor does energy have any value. We're talking about economic rent. So part of the financial sectors use part of its income to subsidize economic schools and universities to change the vocabulary. Our vocabulary is different from the realistic vocabulary that we had in the 19th century. Land doesn't really have a value. Nature creates it. A value is created by people working and creating it. But nature provides the land, and the public sector's spending on infrastructure creates the rent of location, which increases land prices. Nature provides the oil. So economic rent is what we're talking about. And this economic rent of land and oil and minerals and monopolies belongs in the public domain, so that you don't have to have an income tax and excise taxes and value-added taxes on labor and industry. You should tax the rentiers, not labor and industry. That's what a free market meant in the 19th century, and it means inverted. Today, a free market is the right for the rentiers to avoid taxes and shift the entire tax base onto labor and industry, and they do this by twisting around and perverting the English language to get rid of the analytic language that you need to even explain how most income and most wealth is unearned.
How about you, Tamad? Do you think that we need to clarify how we talk about and define value?
Yeah, well, in the case of energy, first we have to clarify the fact that, there are some sources of energy which create negative value because of global climate change and climate warming and, all the negative external effect of using some energy. So we have to make some of the energy sources just illegal. We have to keep some of the oil in the ground. We have to stop looking for new oil and gas. So, so the solution to some of the energy questions we have is just to make illegal, the use of certain energy and to move to other energy. So that's part of the answer. Now, if we have done that and we deal with energies that don't have the negative, this much bigger negative impact on mankind than their positive productive impact, then redistribution of wealth must be about all forms of wealth, whether it's rent or energy or financial assets or housing, we need to have a permanent circulation of wealth and power. So, that's the way I view, taxation of wealth will be a permanent, progressive tax on net wealth, which in effect, will wipe out all the biggest wealth right away. Say up to 90% tax per year for billionaire. But among there will still be some people who own $100,000, some people who own 1 million or 2 million. But there will be a permanent circulation of wealth holdings within this limited wealth gap that will still exist. And this should be for all forms of wealth, whether it's land or housing or whatever the origin.
Thank you. We seem to have quite a number of students in the audience today. So we have a question about student debt and what types of resistance students could make to change the social relationship of debt that they get forced into. Do you have any suggestions on rhetorical points that students need to engage with in order to gain support for a debt jubilee on their debts? Michael, you want to?
I wish there were. I don't see any because you have a president of the United States who wrote the law saying that you're not allowed to wipe out student debt as a result of bankruptcy. The American philosophy is the way to prevent a middle class from developing is to keep them basically so deeply indebted that they're afraid they have to go to work. They're afraid to leave their jobs. They can't afford houses. The purpose of student debt is to make them dependent. Under socialism in Europe, China, and the old countries, education was free. And the whole idea was you need education in order to grow. Under the finance capitalist system, and this is not industrial capitalism anymore. This is financial capitalism, very different. You use a basic need as a means of saying your money or your life. If you don't pay us, then you'll just have to forego your education. So the price of getting access to a labor force is to go so deeply into debt that you're going to have to work for a living, and you're going to have to work for what we pay you. There's a class war on, and you got to realize that. And there's very little you can do with students, because if you don't, right now, I guess if you all stop paying the debt, make the government throw 20 million of you in jail, they can't do it. The only thing to do, I guess, would be a strike. But in the meanwhile, they're going to try to go after your credit rating. They're going to try to fight you. You have to back politicians who are willing to change this. And unfortunately, there is no party that's in favor of canceling student debt or any kind of debt in the United States, because the political parties are subsidized by the banking and the financial sector. So I don't see a way out.
Thomas?
Yeah, well, I agree with Michael that with this government and with this president in the US, it's probably going to be difficult to get a lot going. But and I also agree that the entire political system in the US, in a way, is so corrupt by money and the way campaigns are financed, and the way media also are financed and are biased in the way they cover the different possible candidates. This makes it very difficult. That being said, again, if we go back to 18 months ago, there were candidates in the Democratic primary which. Together, Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, I don't put them exactly together, of course, but they had a substantial share of the vote. And on the issue of student debt, I think different things could have happened with a different president and a different majority. So I think it's important also to be hopeful and to try to prepare, what will be a more successful coalition or a more successful political campaign in the future. And it's important to always remember that, as Michael was saying, the true source of economic prosperity is not financial capitalism. It is investment in education, investment in the real economy, in infrastructure. And, when in the middle of the 20th century, in the 1950s, 1960s, when the US were in a situation of economic dominance over the rest of the world, it was not through extreme financial inequality. You had 19% top income tax rate after Roosevelt, but you had a big educational advance. as compared to, at that time, you had 90% of a cohort will go to high school in the US in 1950s, 1960s. At the same time, it was 20-30% in Germany or in France. And this was this educational advance which made prosperity historically, and we seem to have forgotten this, in the US following, since the 1980s. But so we have to manage to put this back on this agenda. But that's of course that's not easy.
Well, thank you very much to both of our speakers today. I think you've helped open our minds and think about this topic a little more clearly. Even though we're still not exactly sure how to overcome these tremendous forces that are working against us to find solutions that really, at the end of the day, I don't think anything either one of you has said is truly radical in the sense of history. I mean, we have, as human beings, we have approached and confronted these problems before, and there have been good practical solutions that both of you have offered. So I wanted to just turn the floor over to Professor Steve King now. And again, thank you everyone for participating in this conversation today.
Thank you for our speakers, and thank you for the audience as well. I'm sorry that there was only 1 hour, so there's been over 70 questions asked. We'd be here for 3 hours trying to answer them, so we took a couple out to make it worthwhile. I think I want to particularly thank Thomas for being part of this debate, because one thing Michael and I've experienced so frequently is that we can't get anybody in the establishment to join into discussions with us outside the establishment, and I really respect you and honour you for doing that. And it also shows the tremendous contribution that David made by being somebody who can talk to everybody, and everybody enjoys talking to David. We hope we can maintain that through the idea of forthcoming debates, and we look forward to seeing you all in the future installments in the Fight Club. So thank you, everybody.